And so right now on our agenda, we want to talk about education. And I would like to turn the facilitation to our parliamentarian um, and executive committee member, Patrick Brown. He carries several other titles throughout the community. But at this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Patrick to introduce our guest and for us to uh, dive into looking at state of education here in Arizona. And on a larger perspective, education is one of the premier targets of the NAACP. And so, Patrick, would you introduce our guest and we talk about the state of education here in Arizona?
All right. Thank you, Dr. Harden. Good afternoon, everybody. Y'all know who I am, Patrick Brown, member to NAACP, parliamentarian, and amongst other duties as assigned. Uh, I guess, if you've been even mildly paying attention to everything that's going on in the world, you know that education has been a major topic that has been impacting our communities and really communities around the state, around the country. And so I think just kind of with the way things are kind of unfolding when it comes to, things going on at the state capitol or even things going on at the congressional level. Education is a hot topic. So today I have the pleasure of bringing on an education advocate, an education activist, and someone who cares about kids, whether it's from the south side to the west side to the east side to the north side. And we're going to have a conversation here to talk a little bit about what's going on in education. So before I turn things over to Beth Lewis, I just want to kind of level set kind of how we're going to do this. We want to make this kind of a little bit more of a conversation, not so much of I'd say a lecture, if you will. Coming from the education ranks myself, I know I can kind of get on a roll. So what we'd like to do is, like I said, Beth is going to, of course, got some stuff. She's going to present to us some data about what's going on statewide, and then I've got some questions. I know you guys will have some questions. So just so we kind of, keep things rolling, as you think of questions, as you have questions, go ahead and just drop those in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat while we're doing that, and we'll just get it all kind of mixed into our talk today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Beth Lewis.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much, Patrick and Dr. Harden, and for y'all having me. It's really good to be here. I am going to share a few slides. If that could be turned on, Patrick, that would be awesome. So I'm Beth Lewis. As Patrick said, I am an educator. I started teaching in 2010 out in the Fowler district, which is on the west side. And then I taught there for several years, taught in the Balts district for several years, mostly elementary and middle school. I'm the wild person that prefers teaching middle schoolers over anything else. So I don't know, maybe there's a special spot for me in heaven. And then I taught in Tempe for some time. And so all Title I schools, and had really, really great experiences, although, felt the impacts of the defunding of public education firsthand very much, and also saw the disparities across districts firsthand too, which is really what fuels my work. Thank you, Patrick. Is those disparities and how do we rectify them? In Arizona, we are going the wrong direction, that's for sure. So I helped to co-found Save Our Schools Arizona. If you're not as familiar with us, we have a C3 and a C4. So you might recognize, like the red shirts, which is like our political arm, these blue shirts around public schools. We kind of do everything. We've got 20,000 education advocates across Arizona. So we're probably the biggest grassroots group in the whole state. We're nonpartisan and we're fighting for strong public schools. Quick, just sort of level setting in terms of where we are in Arizona. Most of you probably know that our per pupil funding is extremely low. The way we fund schools is really backwards. We're 49th in the US. So we are not competitive, and Arizona state lawmakers make those decisions in their budgets every year. They like to brag that they're making investments in our schools, but it really hasn't gotten better. And that leads to crowded class sizes, poorly funded teachers, all sorts of other issues across our schools. And I know Patrick mentioned that we wanted to do a little, just sort of, again, level set about vouchers. So I pulled together a few slides. Arizona has had vouchers for about 25 years. So Arizona started with something called an STO voucher, which is a tax credit. We've had ESA vouchers since 2011. Those are just a different mechanism. Again, a voucher is just funding private schools with public funds. And the ESA, in this case in Arizona, can be used for private school, micro school, homeschool. And of course, that was expanded universally in 2022, so about 3 years ago, by Governor Ducey and the legislature. And you can see how targeted the program was for many years. See, it was a really small program. It was expanded incrementally from 2011 all the way to 2022. And then once Ducey passed universal vouchers, gloves came off. You see this hockey stick graph, and we are now up to $1 billion this coming school year for the voucher program, which is going to, again, private school, homeschool, etc. Vouchers in Arizona and across the country are often sold as a way to help low-income students, to help students in rural areas, to help students in urban areas. And the reality in Arizona and across the country is really the opposite. The people statistically who are benefiting are coming from higher income households. They're white people in the suburbs, and they're people who are already enrolled in private school or homeschool. Which, you know, at this point, budgets are moral documents. Our legislature consistently says it doesn't have any funding for our K-12 schools, and yet it dug in the couch cushions and found $1 billion for ESA vouchers, which is more than 1 in 10 K-12 dollars. And, you know, looking at that outside of the targeted vouchers, that's like $600 million in opportunity costs that could be used to keep our schools open in our communities, to raise that teacher pay, to get smaller class sizes, to get gardens in our schools, right? All of the things that we know our local community schools really need, and to make sure that there are better programs for parent engagement and, you know, better wraparound services for families and for kids. I could go on about that all day long. We know the needs of our schools. And I will just leave with the fact that the advocates who push vouchers onto our schools said that they were not going to hurt our public schools. They've said that over and over, and now we've got bus routes being slashed. We've got social workers being eliminated. We've got teachers being cut. We've got schools closing campuses. And a lot of these schools are Title I schools. They are, in many cases, historic schools that serve majority BIPOC communities. And, you know, I think a lot of us, I know Patrick and I predicted this long ago, and now, you know, it's coming to roost, and it's really painful to watch. So that's sort of just high level information of where we are. And I'm going to stop sharing and give it back to you, Patrick.
All right. Thank you, Beth. Yeah, it's one of those things where, you know, you when you're right about something, you want to be right, but then you don't want to be right. And unfortunately, you know, we're seeing this really across the state, and sadly, we're seeing it across the country. So kind of to start things off, I know, you know, said do some current events here real quick. I know I would say just this week, the Trump administration issued executive order, you know, officially dismantling the Federal Department of Education. And, you know, could you maybe talk a little bit about kind of how those impacts are going to impact public education and how that's going to, you know, impact Arizona?
Absolutely. Yeah. So on Thursday, Trump signed that executive order. It is unlawful. It will be litigated. You know, the president does not have authority to unilaterally undo an act of Congress. Only Congress can do that. However, talking through this, you know, if he gets away with this and the executive order does go through, then basically, you know, we're talking about 20% of funding for Arizona. That federal funding can vary a lot from state to state. It can be as low as 5% of a state's funding. in some states that actually fund their schools. Arizona is one of the highest percentage of federal funding because our state does such a poor job. And because we have so many Title I students, so many students on IEPs, right? So many Native students. So we have a lot of kids that receive federal resources. $2.8 billion in Arizona that's at stake. And there's also, outside of the funding, which is really obviously critical, we're talking about legal protections. So the Office of Civil Rights is housed in the Department of Ed. Anybody who's been watching Trump in the last 2 months knows that he's on a rampage to dismantle civil rights and in every way that he can. And I don't know that the Office of Civil Rights will survive this administration or look anything like what it does now. But I certainly think that a way to fast track the dismantling of the OCR is to get rid of the Department of Ed. And it might even be the biggest reason for dismantling the Department of Ed if you're somebody like Mr. Trump. And then the last thing I'll say there is that Project 2025 and Trump have suggested something called block grants to the states. And so these block grants are really essentially can be voucherized by our state legislature. If they take all of these funds and they say, here's 2.8 billion, we're returning it to the states, and the state legislature has authority to redistribute those funds because they will be discretionary. I think we know what our state legislature, what somebody like Superintendent Horn would do with those funds.
Okay. So now you mentioned a couple of items. So I definitely want to kind of address a few things where, just think of like people who are not as, say, versed in like kind of the specifics of education. So you mentioned things like IEPs. What are some of the, like, just, I guess, put into perspective of a parent who is, just sending their kid to school? Where do we see potentially some of those, say, financial cuts? Where would they potentially feel it, especially if they fall into maybe they are getting some sort of IEP services or services through their public school?
So right now, families should expect to receive the same services, but should funding, well, I say that, except that all special education was moved to the Department of Health and Human Services yesterday, which would be under Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which obviously gives me some major heartburn because Mr. RFK does not have any education credentials and he doesn't have any special education credentials. But our public schools know what they're doing, right? And at this point, should they continue to receive the same level of funding and support, the schools will continue providing the same level of resources. However, families don't have the same level of recourse. If there aren't people in place to basically go to court for them. So what happens in Arizona, anybody who's been a teacher, you have situations where families come in and say, hey, I don't think my kid's IEP is being met. I don't think that their minutes are being met. I don't think that this accommodation is correct. And of course, the school team will try and take care of that. But the parent has to have that recourse to say, I'm still really unhappy. And that happens. And families can't afford lawyers, right? I mean, that's a huge expense. And so typically they've gone to the Department of Education federally and they've said, I need protection here. And if we don't have experienced folks in those seats in DC able to do that work, then those families don't have that recourse.
All right. So, and again, so we kind of started this whole thing kind of talking at the federal level, but again, we're in Arizona, we're in Maricopa County. So, and I want to kind of go back to something you mentioned in your opening presentation when you talked about just kind of that impact on school closures. So, just for people who, like I said, are maybe just learning how the funding models work or things of that nature, I guess where's the correlation if people are say utilizing ESA, school vouchers or whatnot versus sending their child to say their local public school, where is that, I guess, that impact coming from? Because kind of that argument that some folks are making is like, well, I'm just taking the money out that would have gone to my kid if I sent him to the school down the street. I'm just taking that. So where's the impact?
Yeah, so I think our legislature has set up our public schools to fail, and vouchers are part of that. The way that we fund our schools, we don't have any cushion because we only fund per student. That means we're not really funding principals, counselors, librarians, art teachers, right? All of that gets skimmed away. And so when even just a handful of kids leave a school, it makes a huge financial impact in a way that if we were funding the school, it wouldn't. And so that's why we're seeing so many schools have to shut down. It's not really, I mean, we're not seeing a mass exodus from our public schools. I pulled some numbers. I thought you all might find this interesting. So I just pulled Phoenix area, Phoenix Union High School District. So there are about 1,500 students using the voucher in the boundaries of Phoenix Union, which is about $15 million. But 97% of those kids were never in public school. So they're not leaving public school. They just already lived in Phoenix. Their families were already well off, and now they're using that funding. But that funding is not available to Phoenix Union to offset a school closure. I pulled Roosevelt because they know, we just had 5 schools shut down in Roosevelt. It's only 800 students. I say only, I mean, for a small district, that's a lot. $8 million a year. 90% of those kids never in a public school. So let's say 10% did leave Roosevelt schools to go on a voucher. That that is enough to force the school closure. And our schools, they're under-resourced, but we have to do better. We have to find ways to involve the community better. I'm not ever going to be an apologist and say our public schools are perfect. And that's not, that's not the conversation we're here to have. But if they were well-resourced, they could serve every kid's needs. And if we were able to train our teachers better, we could do better. But most of the families in Roosevelt are extremely happy. You see those surveys. Most of the families in Phoenix Union are extremely happy. And the educators are doing phenomenal work. And, they're not leaving. The choices are being made by folks who already had a choice and had the money to fund it. So did that answer your question, Patrick? I feel like I left part of it.
No, it did. It did. And that actually brings another question. So, the conversation of school choice has been one that's been, I would say, I've heard it like for years. I think, anyone who's, either been around education in Arizona has heard that conversation. And so I think, when people kind of, we're throwing a lot of terms out, we're talking about like ESAs, we're talking about private schools, of course we have charters, just to kind of help, kind of, I guess, say, educate the folks here who may, either use the terms interchangeably or may not, understand kind of maybe what differentiates through. So just to kind of help out, like, what is the difference? So for example, if I send my child, if I get my voucher, I send my child to, say a private school, am I getting the same, aren't I getting the same services that I would get if I sent them to, say, your traditional public school?
Great question. So, I mean, the main answer is no. If you're in a public school, the school is required to accept your kid. The school is required to serve your students' needs. If they're an English language learner, they have to meet those needs legally, right? If they're on an IEP, you've got to meet the IEP legally. Doesn't mean it's always perfect, but legally there is that requirement. And then, they got to give kids a ride and they got to feed kids. They have to open up their books to the public. They have to take public input and they have to tell people how they're spending their money. And none of that is true with private schools. None of it. For me, the most important thing is that public schools accept all kids and meet their needs. Private schools can pick and choose their kids. And at the end of the day, like, I'm an educator. You walk in my classroom, I'm going to meet you where you are, and I'm going to get to know what you need, and I'm going to lift up, whatever your needs are. In a private school, I can't even imagine teaching in a private school, but it's just saying like, well, no, we can't meet your needs. This is not a good fit for you. But that happens all the time. Right now, the law says that private schools cannot discriminate on a few legally protected classes, and part of that is race. I don't know how long that stands, given the state of our country right now. I sure hope it does, but that is a legally protected class and situation that might not continue.
So if I'm hearing you, so like just make sure, well, I'm understand you. If I were to select a private school, send my child there, and let's say they had they had an IEP or 504 or something of that nature, and the private school they were not following the guidelines there. What I mean, what type of recourse would I have as a parent?
In the private school?
Yes, at a private school.
You'd have none. You'd have none. I mean, I was just talking to Quante Cruz, who's a Arizona lawmaker. She went through this. She sent her child, and she talks about this publicly all the time. She took her kid to a private school, and her son's IEP was not being met. And she said, "You have to service my kid's needs." And they pointed at the paperwork and said, "No, it says we don't." And at that point, she tried to lawyer up and say, "You're a school. You have to meet my kid's needs." And at that point, she told me that she realized, like, this is different than public education. And honestly, that's why I fight so hard for public education.
Okay, so we got a question in the chat from Taylor Hornback, and I'm just going to read it verbatim for what she put. So she says, "So we're essentially saying monies are commingled for vouchers and school funding. So vouchers are pulling from school budgets."
So they're commingled in the K-12 budget. So when the legislature passes the full state budget each year, there's a bucket for K-12, and vouchers and public schools are in the same bucket. Now, vouchers have no ceiling, so it is a push and a pull. Yeah.
Okay. So along those lines, so because we're talking, I know we could talk about funding all day, but I'm going to kind of just talk about just kind of the heads up accountability, things like that. So I think, any parent wants their child to go to a situation where they know the kids are getting a quality, education. So, if they're thinking like, hey, I want my kid to do well, on the SATs, or I want to, have them go to a good college or get a scholarship or things of that nature. So again, we're talking about kind of, people understanding the differences or just kind of, getting all that, if you're a parent, like, I know, like, they publish all of the achievement data for, say, Phoenix Union or for Chandler Unified or what have you. So where can a parent find that information about, say schools are receiving vouchers that, they're getting public money, but how can you see like how well they're doing their job?
You can't. It's just, there's no real data. We can't see the academic results because there's no required testing. So there then is no school letter grade. The ADE puts all district schools and charter schools through the letter grading process, but private schools are not part of that. So, I as a parent would have to take my kids and go over to the school of my choosing and ask them questions and just hope that they answered them faithfully.
Okay. And I see, yeah, Dr. Harden has her hand up, so go ahead and you have a
Hi.
question.
Okay, so we understand that the administration is not favorable to education, and unfortunately, we have leaders at the top who are being appointed to positions that they do not have background or experience in all the way all across the administration. So we understand that people in charge of education from the federal level may not understand what the real needs are because they don't know about education. So how does that trickle down again? Like one question is to the state. What do you think might happen to state funding? Second thing, more clearly, for us, let's say non-educators, if we have non-educators and we don't know it as in depth as you do, this push and pull between vouchers, how vouchers are taken away from public schools, what is kind of like a simplified message that, if that makes sense, a simplified message that we can say when we're out in the public, right? As informational purposes, pretty much the NAACP is very pro public school because I believe they believe that it really provides more equity and not necessarily proponent of vouchers. I know I'm like throwing like 10 things at you at once. And I believe it
okay.
was Isaac. I think it was Isaac School District that just had to close. One local school district just had to close, right? I think they gave their teachers a week notice and then they had to close it down. Is that
That
a direct impact from what's happening at the federal level or state level? Okay, so
I'll try and go in reverse.
okay,
See how
thank
I
you.
do. No, great questions. The Isaac district situation is a little different, I would say, than even like the Roosevelt situation because there was a financial issue. I think there was some mismanagement that's been uncovered and they were put under a receivership. They are considering shutting down 2 schools. It's a little bit of a mess over there, and I don't want to attribute that specifically to vouchers, but there's a more clear connection with Roosevelt, with a bunch of the other schools that are considering like Phoenix L right now. So Phoenix L is considering, they're actually voting on Tuesday. And the 2 schools that they're considering closing are the Hurd School and then the Paul Lawrence Dunbar School, which is the longest running historically Black elementary school in Arizona. It just celebrated its 100th year. And some folks, kind of come in and say, oh, it's the declining birth rates. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. And it's like, if our state hadn't chosen to fund $1 billion voucher boondoggle for the rich, then we could be shoring up these schools. There is no reason that these schools need to be shut down. And now these kids are going to have to bus an extra 20 minutes to go to a school that is not in their community. And to me, that's the most important thing. So you asked for like, what do we say out in the community? I mean, our local historic community schools are being shut down. They have, a
Historical
lot of
schools are
these,
being,
yeah, like deeply rooted schools in order to fund vouchers for the rich. And it's not always for the rich, but statistically, that's the vast majority. And you will find success stories, right? Like I'm not gonna lie. Like you're gonna hear, oh, my kid got to go to Brophy and they never would have. But that's rare. Brophy has the kids they want to have. And you might find like a really great micro school that's operated by some great folks, and that's great. But the vast majority of these vouchers are going to well-off white folks in the suburbs. And that's the thing that makes me mad
and I
because we're
think
shutting down our schools.
just to add to what you're saying is research that the NAACP did several years ago. They did a video that was like a backpack full of cash. Uh, and in that, if I remember correctly, it was saying that if you analyze the data, let's see, like there private schools and public schools do not do private schools or charter schools do not do any better with educating than public schools if you I'm forgetting the research term, if you look at all things that are equal, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
There's a misperception by the general public that, oh, private schools or charter schools do a better job of educating students. But if sort of like if you match apples to apples, the charter schools do not do any better, or the micro
absolutely. Yeah.
schools. I don't know,
And
if you've heard of that research, if you know what I'm trying to refer to.
yeah, there's a lot of great research. I can put a link in the chat for you all to check out. But yes, and that's been over many years. Nobody's ever found that voucher students outperform, especially when you consider, things like SES, like income, et cetera.
Mhm.
And, I mean, like I said, the reality is like the elite schools that seem to be producing, good outcomes like Brophy already have the kids they want. They provide scholarships to the kids they want because they pick and choose their kids. And, if that's what we end up as an education model, then we're going to have tiered education that's sort of like a caste system. And I think it'll be racially stratified. I think it'll be stratified by class. And I think it'll keep a lot of kids down. And it will remove that equalizing factor because people are going to walk away from funding our schools, you know? I mean, it's just, if you kind of think about it playing out over the next like 10, 15 years, it's like, wait, so they're going to have these elite choice academies that we all have to pay for, and then everybody else is left to the public schools that they decide not to pay for. Are we going to end up like a lot of countries around the world where everybody has to pay for school, and if you don't have money, then your kids don't go to school? I don't know. It
Okay.
sounds crazy, but that's the status of a lot of other countries.
And so, Beth, let me make sure I understood correctly. Based on all of your research and all your data, a takeaway is some of the public schools, like in Roosevelt, that are being closed would not necessarily have to be closed if we weren't putting so much state money into the ESA pot of money, into the
Yes.
voucher program.
Yes. And that one, I think Roosevelt is a clear example. They were trying to save $8 million a year by shutting down those campuses. $8 million in the Roosevelt boundaries is going to vouchers. So that one, it could not be more clear.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So Beth, it sounds, if I'm hearing you correctly, basically, when we look at what's happening with school vouchers, when we look at how funding is not going into, you know, where we wanted to, into education, to, you know, a lot of stuff in between. If I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like we're trying to go away from a historical model within the United States that, you know, public education allows anyone from any economic, ethnic, social background to have an opportunity to learn, to basically you got to pay to get even just basic education.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, a lot of the private schools, the only private schools that do well, typically charge $15,000, $20,000 a kid, even in Arizona. So if you're getting a $7,000, $8,000 voucher, you know, the state's basically saying, well, here's what we fund the public schools at. You can have it, but you have to be well off enough to afford the rest of that good education, quote unquote, good education. I think my question is, if that's the case and it takes $15,000 to well educate and well resource a kid to lift them up to their best chance for educational success in a future, then why aren't we funding all kids at that rate, regardless of what their family can afford?
And I think that, like, we have to see a question from Nancy Peace, and I think this is timely to what we're saying here. So, since many of the rules are not the same or not enforced in charter schools, how can public schools compete?
Well, yeah, I mean, that brings up such a good point where charters are this weird middle. So I'll get to the compete part. So public district schools are publicly funded, publicly run. Charter schools are publicly funded, privately run, so they can make a profit. And then private schools are the ones receiving the voucher, and have like no accountability, totally privately run, totally private profits. So it's this weird leveling. Public district schools are obviously doing the most with the least all the time. And I like how you say compete, because, you know, you see these flashy ads all over the place for private schools and for charter schools. They have this budget apparently to do all of this marketing. I don't know how our district schools can compete. I think district schools are trying in some areas. When I see it done best, it's usually community rooted, though. It's, hey, let's bring in parents. Let's talk about what you want. And in some places that's being done well, and in some places that feels like an afterthought. And I think that if district schools don't bring in parents in the community better, we're going to keep having these conversations. So, I mean, that's my honest answer is if they want to compete, they got to be in community and do better. But again, they're doing better with nothing.
So I want to, you mentioned a good point when you mentioned, kind of the difference between public schools, charter schools, private schools. So when you said with the charter schools, they're often a private entity operating a public school. So let me ask you this question. I know recently this hit the news, might be a few weeks old now, but Primavera, which is an online charter school, recently was shut down by the state. When something like that happens, what is the recourse for the parents, or what is the impact on the kids who are, actively enrolled in a school like that?
Yeah, the great question. So that's a charter, got shut down for good reason, sounds like. So now those families are going to have to scramble and find another charter or send their kid back to district school or use an ESA. That happened with an ESA school a couple months ago too. The charter board shut down a charter, so they converted to a private school overnight and started taking in voucher dollars, and then they had to shut down again because of total mismanagement. I could see Primavera just becoming a voucher school though. I don't know about you, Patrick, but I feel like that's the sort of obvious next step because it's more money and it's less oversight. So the charter board shut them down because they were actually overseeing what they were doing and realized it was not meeting kids' needs. If they convert to a private school, there's no oversight.
I see it as basically probably they could easily go into like a fee for service model, especially considering how they're set up, their structure. It's an online school, that type of stuff. So yeah, I could just pay for taking, a 16-week math class, things of that nature. I see Taylor, you have your hand up. I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute to ask your question.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Talay here. I did have a question. So this was maybe a year and a half ago, either on NPR or KTAR, that I was hearing a report of a misuse of voucher funds. And the story was, I believe there was a family who had used vouchers to purchase recreational vehicles and claimed it as extracurricular, activity / education. And so I know we're talking a lot, and this is very helpful, about vouchers as it relates to, physical in-school learning. But can you shed some light on the loopholes that are happening or some things where there's a misuse of voucher funds? Because that was my first instance of hearing something to that extreme where folks are arguing, again, in this case, that it was learning, educational, but they were buying recreational vehicles for their children.
Yep, that definitely happened. Thank you for the question, Talay. The state board did reject that finally, but they were ATV vehicles. But this is happening all over the place. It's mostly with homeschool families because it's just so much funding. I mean, you don't need $7,000 a kid to homeschool your kids. You really don't. And often in their like Facebook groups, you'll see folks saying, I don't know what to do with all of this money. Does anybody have any great ideas? And Tom Horn has set up the program in such a way that, all you need to do is upload a curriculum that says that it's educational and it will be approved. He's also set it up so that up to $2,000, everything is automatically approved. So folks are using ChatGPT to create curriculum. So I've seen things like a mini fridge to teach the animal dissection. We need to have a mini fridge. I saw one that was a tabletop ice maker to teach the 3 states of matter. And you get the drift. I mean, you can basically code anything as educational if you get creative. They do deny some things. Tom Horn just sent out a letter last week, which was interesting, where he was trying to defend himself, and he said, well, we denied a $24,000 golf simulator, so we are doing our jobs. And I think that the legislature has refused to put any sort of limits on this program, and so we're just going to keep seeing more and more of that. There was a great article last year about $304 million and where it went in the voucher program. And there were things like, I think it was a $10,000 purchase at a sewing machine store. I haven't been to a sewing machine store, so I don't know, but I feel like that would be a lot of equipment. It was like $5,000 in one purchase for like a golf store. There were all of these like ski passes. I mean, it's like anything else when you give people free money and you put very few limits on it. Like there are people who are going to grift and there's businesses that are going to take advantage, and it's just human nature. I don't know if I put that on them or if I put it on the legislature, not understanding human nature and saying, yeah, we need to have some sort of rules on this, but it's a mess.
So along Talay's message, and I apologize, Talay, I totally slaughtered your name. I'm sorry. But she brings up a really good point. So if we look at, what goes on in our public schools, there are procurement laws. You have to justify, rationalize what your spending is, or it's either a narrowly defined, line item. And if somebody breaks those laws, best case scenario, they just lose their job, but, the district is sometimes on the hook for return that money. What happens? So in a situation like, you just kind of gave out, say parents says, hey, I'm buying like, I'm buying a, brand new electric EV to teach driver's ed to my kid. And Department of Ed says, oh, yeah, we're not okay with that. What happens? Does the person just have to take the car back to the dealership? Are they on the hook for the money, or is it just like don't ever do it again? What happens with that?
Sorry, I was answering a question in the chat and I got my brain distracted. But I mean, there's no recourse. That money is never coming back to the state. I do hear from the new director that they are going to be doing, after they automatically approve the $2,000, they're going to be doing some sort of risk-based assessment. I've lost all trust in the ADE under Superintendent Horn. I'm hoping that whoever they are, regardless of party, we get somebody who actually cares about kids this next time around. But yeah, that money's not coming back. And there's also a lot of like, well, they got their money deposited and spent all of it at the beginning of Q4, and then they sent their kid back to public school. The public school didn't get funding to teach their kid. They got all of these nice appliances for their kitchen. Nobody's ever going to do anything about it.
So I want to make sure I understand the last part. If someone decides to utilize vouchers to send their child to homeschool, whatever they're going to do with their kid, and they realize that, you know what, physics ain't quite my bag, and they send them back to a public school, that child's is fundamentally not going to be funded. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right. Specifically at the end of the year. I mean, it's kind of that 100-day.
Right.
But yes, and that does happen a lot. That also brings up another issue with the program, which is that nobody's tracking it. So we don't know, because there's no state ID associated with students taking the voucher, we don't know the movement of kids. And so there's nobody who's able to say, oh, well, they were homeschooling and then they went to private school and then they went back to the public school. Not only does that create an issue with making sure that the schools are funded, specifically the public school, but also, what's going on with the kid? We don't know. And that's something that really worries me as an educator. Like, I know that we would all like to, in a perfect world, believe that every kid is in a beautiful home with parents who care about them and know how to meet their needs, but it's not always the case. And oftentimes in our public schools, our social workers and our counselors and our educators uncover really horrific situations. And without being in a public school, I worry that there are a lot of folks whose situations are not being uncovered.
So let me ask you another question here, and this is kind of along, it kind of is related to something we were talking about earlier when it came to, the types of, school, the differences between the schools. So, again, school choice is a thing in Arizona, and so say a child goes through, say, a private school, or they go through a micro school or something like that. Is there so I guess I'm sorry. Let me bring this out, and I'm thinking educator mode. So let me bring it more to a layperson's thing. So when they're thinking about, okay, I want my child to go into post-secondary, I want them to go to community college or university. Is there a way for a parent, as they're looking at kind of this menu of options out here, if they're looking at using a voucher to send their child to a private school, or they're looking to homeschool, is there a concern that they would be able to get their child into, say, a state university or a university, once they graduate?
There are folks that homeschool that print a diploma at home. There are some universities that will accept that and will, uncover the coursework. There are some curriculum that homeschool educators can, or, like private schools that aren't accredited can download, that could print basically a track that shows that you've completed X number of credits in their courses. Outside of that, there is no guarantee. No. And also for the workforce, right? Like a lot of employers are not going to accept that piece of paper. I think it varies a lot. There are some kids that have great success from being homeschooled and going to private school, and there's some kids that don't.
Okay. So I'm gonna grab some questions from the chat here. So I'm gonna go back to Nancy. And so her question is, are voucher funding is voucher funding available for after school programs? Is that something someone can use the money to pay for?
Yeah. I mean, if you're sending your kid to private school, you're probably not going to have extra money to do that. But if you are, after school is sort of a nebulous term, because if you're homeschooling, there isn't really an after school, but you can use it for whatever you want. You could use it for gymnastics, you can use it for horseback riding, you can use it for underwater basket weaving, you can use it for taking them over to the YMCA. Sure, any of it. You can't use it to go to the public school after school program though. So once you exit your kid from public schools to go on the voucher program, there's not a lot of cross pollinating those dollars, if that makes sense.
Okay. So, and I guess to kind of illustrate that point, if let's say if I'm a homeschool parent and I send my child to horseback riding, could I categorize that as their PE class?
Yes.
Okay. All right. But thinking like more of the traditional, like kind of after school programs that exist in our public schools, is there really like a one-to-one comparison, or is that kind of more like a nebulous thing?
I think you're typically seeing the homeschoolers are in a environment where they're home all day, right? Or they're in programs, so just less utilized. You've probably got somebody who's a stay-at-home mom or dad as part of the program. But yeah, you can use anything for PE. And I don't know, parents, grandparents, like my kids in club basketball, we scrape together the funds to make that work. It is prohibitively expensive. I love our school sports because they're paid for and they're awesome. But that's, something that we decided to do. If I was on a voucher, the state would be paying for my kids' club basketball. And I'm not comfortable with that. I don't think that's how our state funds should be used, especially if they're shutting down local community schools so that my kid can do something extra.
Okay. All right. So we've covered a lot of ground here this afternoon. Got some great questions from our folks here. I'm gonna give Nancy our last question, the next to last question, and then I've got a question for you to kind of wrap things up. So, Nancy, I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you, and why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Or we're gonna try and do that. Oh.
I just kind of wanted to comment on the accreditation part. If a child is able to be admitted into a college afterwards, Maricopa community colleges, if you go 2 years there and you receive your AA, they allow you're guaranteed to go into any of the state colleges if you have a certain GPA. So that's one way that parents can get around that if they don't have, accreditations, or if it doesn't seem like their child did well during homeschooling. I just kind of wanted to mention that.
Oh, all right. Thank you. That's actually great information. And I know just even, and I'll throw in like kind of my background in the workforce development world, even if like someone's going through an apprenticeship program, there are kind of ways to navigate that as well. But all right, so again, we've had some great conversation, Beth, kind of educating and kind of understanding this landscape that we're in. So I guess here's like my final question. So I think a lot of people just kind of based on some of the comments in the chat and things of that nature. Honestly, like what can people hearing this, understanding like what the challenges are with the money and the issues with the money and things of that nature, what can people do? What can say the folks on this call, once they leave here, what can they do about, I guess, what's going on, or at least add some level of equity or address a lot of the issues that were proposed this afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, as you all can see, it's really it's multifaceted. There's so many different ways you can look at this program and think, oh, yikes. But I think it's more important to really focus on the why, right? Like, why are they pushing these vouchers? What does this have to do with all of these federal actions from the new administration? Like, I want to underscore that this is truly a war on public education. The folks in power in this country who have billions of dollars, who have put certain people in power, are the same folks who've been working to push vouchers in Arizona for decades. The Venn diagram's a circle. So we really have to understand, all right, so vouchers are a push for white supremacy. They are a push for Christian nationalism, right? At their root, they're a push for making our kids into profit. All of those things go directly back to Project 2025 and the people who are trying to dismantle the Department of Public Education nationally, right? So I really want us to not decouple those things. Understand they're the same. It's the same actors. It's the same playbook. What can you do? This sounds really trite, but I feel like people do not know what we just talked about. And I don't know how we move forward if we don't get folks on board and help people understand. And it doesn't mean, I mean, maybe, if you're talking to somebody who loves the voucher program, that's fine. Maybe that's not the fight. Maybe their kid is using it and it's going really well. Maybe their grandkid's using it, right? I don't think we need to judge people's personal choices to not act on the larger picture, right? So what can you do? Please help educate friends, family, neighbors about the war on public education, why it's so important to preserve and protect our public schools for our kids, especially for kids with disabilities, kids who are in Title I areas, right? To keep our public schools open for our communities. And also I would just say our public schools are struggling. Anything you could do to go into schools, to go to school board meetings and bear witness, to speak up for educators, even just dropping off a quick, here are some donuts on a Friday morning. I cannot tell you how much it means to our educators. It sounds small, but it's huge because our educators are doing so much with so little and they don't receive a lot of thanks. And when the community lifts them up, when they feel like somebody who just lives near the school dropped off some kindness for them, it means everything. There are going to be probably walk-ins that we're going to start seeing where people are walking in community. Educators are leading these. We are supporting them. Parents, community members coming in to show kids, we love you. We don't want your schools to shut down. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to stand up for public education. And I just really encourage you to join in with love for kids in your heart and to know the big picture agenda that we are facing right now.
All right. Thank you, Beth. Thank you for joining us. I want to, before I hand things over to Dr. Harden to close us out, I wanted to, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but, just the thought occurred to me here is understanding the historical context with the school voucher program is that if you really follow the history, kind of school vouchers in the United States, at least in the form that we're kind of seeing it now, goes back to around the time of Brown v. Board of Education, that decision coming down from the Supreme Court. And so as Southern schools, segregation schools, as those schools were, are those individuals that were opposed to school integrations, were trying to navigate ways to either defy the law, or in many cases they tried to just shut down their school districts so nobody was going to school, and they found that they couldn't do that. Then they started creating the voucher programs because they started creating these private academies. So even today, there are a lot of Southern private academies that still exist that found their origins as a way to as an end around the Brown v. Board of decision, and for people to pull their money out of their local public schools, so that say white children didn't have to go to school with black children and things of that nature. So I think one thing to understand is that a lot of the things we're facing, when it comes to the attacks on public education, they're not new. They're often really horrible old ideas that are being repackaged to for another go round to do harm. So again, to echo what Beth said, is like you gotta understand what's going on, gotta speak up, gotta be an advocate in a way that makes sense for you, because at the end of the day, it's not about those of us on this call, because we're all grown. We've all gotten to the other side of our education, journeys, but many of us on this call have children. We have children that are in school. Some of y'all, have grandchildren that are in school. And for those of y'all who don't have kids at all, you know what? That kid that, is your neighbor's kid or whatnot could be somebody who is going to do that next great thing to move us forward in society, but they need a place to grow and to be that person. So public education is a great equalizer. It provides opportunity for all, and we've got to protect it. So with that said, I'll go ahead and hand things over to Dr. Harden. I'll thank y'all for joining us today.
I'm gonna echo Patrick and saying thank you very much. Thank you, Beth, for giving us the details and statistics and looking at it from research kind of standpoint. Just wanted to remind people that one of the reasons why we think this topic is so important for us to keep present in our mind from an NAACP philosophy is that those of you that believe in the NAACP and are part of the NAACP, remembering that our organization stands for justice and equality for all, justice and equality for all, equal access to all. And one way of looking at this voucher system or the ESA system is that it denies equal access to everyone. And then from a historical perspective, those of you kind of that might be into history, there's a time in this country when education was only available for the wealthy. So we're also talking about income inequality, right? Income inequality. There might be an argument that, well, anybody can take advantage of this the ESA or the voucher program, but in actuality, is that true? If your family has one car, or if your family can't afford to drive your child out of the neighborhood to utilize the vouchers to go to what they think might be a better school, then is that really equal access? So from an NAACP perspective, right, what you want to think about is, do vouchers and these type of ESA programs provide equal access, right? If I know how to do the paperwork and be able to buy some new golf clubs for my children and say that that's their physical education, or we're doing, teaching them biology of how their body works when they're swimming in the clubs, is that fair to folks who don't know how to fill out the paperwork and or be able to even drive their kid to the golf course? So that's what we're talking about, I think, is income inequality and equal access and equal opportunity for everyone. And I believe that's what the NAACP stands for, is equality for everyone. So we need to keep these ideals, and you choose. Do you believe in the NAACP philosophy, or do you believe opposite of that, right? So, and it's an individual choice. And we know that players at the federal level have no idea of what they're doing. And it's preposterous. So, Beth, want to thank you again. And one last thing is we cannot be dismayed, right? Let's don't be distracted. We can't be distracted, and we have to keep our eye on the ball and do what it takes to right this ship back to where it's equal access for everyone. So with that, I say thank you very much and hope to see everybody on the call again the 4th Saturday at 1 o'clock, which is our membership community meeting. And have a great afternoon, everyone. Okay.